Hello and welcome to the Bridge Project. This is the second episode of the series Taking SDGs to the Last Mile in collaboration with the Manipal Academy of Higher Education. Today, we'll have a discussion on global cities and global climate governance towards achieving the SDGs. For this discussion, we have with us Dr. Mauad and Dr. Marielle Papin. Dr. Mauad is an assistant professor, Department of International Relations at Pontificia Universidad Javeriana, Colombia. She holds a PhD in international relations. Her research areas are local and global governance, regional integration, international politics, and climate change. Dr. Marielle Papin is a postdoctoral fellow at McGill University, Canada. She holds a PhD in political science, and her dissertation deals with the emergence of nobility in complex systems. Her research areas include international environmental politics, transnational actors in climate governance, transnational municipal networks, and urban climate governance. This session will be moderated by Dr. Dhanasree Jayaram, Assistant Professor, Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, and Co-Coordinator of Center for Climate Studies, Manipal Academy of Higher Education, India. Over to you, Dhanasree.
Thank you so much, Mrinmoy, once again. And I'm very excited to, in fact, host this episode of on SDGs, which is jointly being organized by Center for Climate Studies, Manipal Academy of Higher Education, and the Bridge Project. And I'm more than excited to have two friends of mine and also two great, fantastic researchers working on a very critical subject of global climate governance and the role of cities in global climate governance, which is even more important to study in this era when almost all actors have a huge stake in as far as global climate governance is concerned. And since both of them are also part of the Earth System Governance, which is something that I'm also affiliated to, I'm very happy to have both of you as part of this podcast. So, in fact, I would like to start by asking both of you, maybe I'll go with Anna first, about your research journey. Since you work on a lot of topics, whether it is about climate governance or about the role of cities, or as you know, as you have also worked on different perspectives on governance in Latin America, particularly Brazil. So I would like to first ask you about your research journey and what are the kind of topics in this particular area that you have focused upon, Anna.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation, the opportunity to talk about such an important issue. My research journey is a bit long. I actually started studying cities and international relations. That was always my main point of research. And then I started focus on climate change because I do think this is the most obvious link to look from the international relations perspective. How do you connect the global and the local? There is no more global issue than climate change, and there is no other place we can see the impact so dramatically than cities. So I started looking to the interconnection of these two levels. And specifically for Latin America, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, specifically, and now Colombia, that I'm based in Colombia now. So mostly of my research is that trying to look how global trends, global flows, global negotiations have impacts on cities in developing countries, specifically in Latin America, and how this international agenda can change the dynamics of local governments in Latin America. So just to begin the conversation, this is a little bit where my research is focused on.
Thank you, Anna. I will come back to you and ask more about your research focus. Coming to you, Marielle, since you work on a lot of topics which Anna mentioned, and that's why it's perfect to have you both in this podcast episode. But in addition to that, you also look at transnational municipal networks. You look at climate and technology interface. You look at global environmental politics as a holistic subject. So maybe you can start by giving a brief sort of insight into your own research journey from which we can carry on this discussion.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Dhanasree, and thank you to the whole team for organizing this podcast. I'm really excited to be here. So, in contrast with Anna, I also started from an IR background, studying political science and then specializing in international relations. And in contrast with Anna, I started my focus a bit more on climate change. And then from then, I got to study cities. And the reason for that is that, so after my master's, I worked for social innovation lab in Mexico City, so as a practitioner for a couple of years. And I was interested in environmental education and especially focusing on climate change. And my boss would always tell me to look at study cases and especially, well, how to apply them to Mexico City. And she would always tell me to look at what C40 did. And C40 is an important city network. And that's how kind of I got into the idea of studying more cities and transnational city networks in climate governance. And then, well, a lot kind of joining my two passions of IR and climate governance and the urban level. I got to study cities and transnational city networks in global climate governance. As for the technology element, I think from my analysis of transnational city networks, I got to see that technology was actually a big part of the solutions that these networks promote in cities. And so that, I mean, we will go back to that, but I think that kind of sparked something in me wondering whether and how these solutions would be the best for cities. So I guess that's a bit of my background regarding the research that I do.
Yeah, thank you, Marielle. So this is also important to know your research journey because both of you, and so am I, are early career researchers who started at some place and we have moved to various other topics concerning global climate governance. And cities, of course, is a very important topic that both of you have chosen to research more upon. Anna, my question to you next is actually more pertaining to your own research. And in one of your articles, you speak about global cities. And it's very interesting to know, first of all, what do you mean by global cities and why do you think cities are global and not necessarily local, as a lot of analysis would go? Secondly, in that particular article where you talk about the changing role of cities in global climate governance, you talk about, in particular, about the Sao Paulo city. And you talk about how the city has been able to combine its climate responses with the international strategies, integrated with more with the global climate governance strategies, but yet fails to sort of implement it in the long run. So maybe you can reflect a bit more on what are your findings as far as global cities in terms of the integration, their integration with the larger agenda, plus why do they fail to exactly implement them in the long run?
Sure. I think global cities is a term that is now being used by internationalists, by urban studies, by geographies, and there is a bit of confusion of what that means actually. And this is a problem I think every one of us researching this topic has faced, like how the concepts I find in the literature really translate the realities I'm observing. So the first thing I tried my research trying to define what global cities meant for me, for my study specifically. And there was cities that had a really active international agenda. So there were cities that were transponding their limits, their local limits, and even their national limits. So cities that were engaged in transnational municipality networks, but also in United Nations conference that had a great flow of commerce, economically, of flow of people, all sort of things. But also for when we are doing research and choosing our cases, we have to establish some concepts why we are choosing those cases. And for me, climate change is also a question of scale. So looking into medium and small cities wasn't my choice, because I thought, okay, what are their contributions to the emissions of greenhouse gas to the total we have in the atmosphere? And that's why I chose big cities that are also in Latin America and to be so-called global cities. Because I was really interested in see their connection with the global and how their emissions would add to the global emissions. So this is one point for me, like for global cities. I am sure other research will have different concepts and different definitions of global cities, and that will mostly be defined by the cases you select. So that was the first step. And then I was really focused on Latin America, because most of the literature was looking to developed cities in developing countries like Germany and Sweden. And when I was looking to my cases, I saw, well, the reality is a little bit different here. So many of the concepts available in the literature did not explain my cases. And that was a great challenge as research, trying to find concepts and explanations for my cases. And one of the things that I found was that there were two moments in their response to climate change. So I used the concept of responses to climate change developed by Betzel and Buckley, where I divided the different responses. So I found that in Latin American cities that have less strong, less solid rule of law, only approving laws and committing internationally to reduce emissions and foster adaptation wasn't enough, because there was a gap between the moment the cities were committing and promising to do different things, and the second moment there was implementation. And although the first moment for my cases were really internationally, like Sao Paulo, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, only start dealing with the climate change agenda because they were global cities, because they were inserted in this global discussion, not because this was a topic that their citizens were demanding from them. So the first period of the response was really international, but the second period of the response, which was implementation, was really local. And that's when we find the difficulties of implementing GHG reduction emissions and also fostering adaptation.
Thank you, Anna. My next question is to Marielle, and actually it is a kind of follow-up from what Anna already mentioned, and I feel this is important because when you talk about sustainable development goals, cities are such a major part of that, and almost all goals apply to cities. So I was just wondering if you could reflect a bit on why cities are such major actors as far as global climate governance is concerned, especially from your own research, I guess, which is more focused on developed countries, and Anna spoke more about the developing countries' cases. So maybe you can talk about why cities, which are one of the largest emitters of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, and why would they contribute more to climate governance in the future?
Well, yeah, thank you. That's a very interesting point. So, well, to kind of sum up on your question, I think cities are a big part of the discussion. First, because, well, today more than 50% of the world population is urban, right? So that makes cities, well, de facto actors of global climate governance, especially in a world where we are seeing non-state actors taking up the stage. So I think that's an important point. Now, regarding the question of large emitters, I think, well, yeah, I think we might be able to say that there's a relationship between very large emitter cities and their goals of working towards the SDGs. I mean, in the global north, for example, you have very important emitters such as New York City, Los Angeles in America, but also in the south, right? I'm thinking of Delhi, for example. And all these cities are part of several global city networks. So they're really trying in terms of global climate governance, which is, well, the subject I'm focusing on, as you know. They're really trying to be visible in this arena. And it might be partly strategic. It might be partly because they see this as a very important issue that they need to tackle, right? But it might be also partly strategic because climate governance, even though it's not progressing as quickly as we would hope, has become a strategic issue for cities. And also, I want to say that one of the problems that cities have is that they all have their own ways of measuring their emissions. So it's really hard to say who are the biggest emitters, right? Because they have their own measuring protocols. And a big positive point for these city networks actually is that some of them are trying to unify measuring protocols, and that might be actually very helpful. Again, that's something that we might discuss a bit more in along with your questions. But I think it's a good point to make right now. Also, I've not studied this subject specifically, but I think that in some cases, as I said, cities might tackle SDG goals to which they're affected, but also some that they feel are more strategic. Climate change might be one of them. I think, for example, Mexico City is part of many climate-related city networks. But it might be less visible in issues that are, in my view, crucial to the city, such as gender equality, SDG 5, or reduced inequalities, SDG 10. Yet they tend to focus on climate change. It might be because it might give them more leverage, right, to attract non-city actors, for example. Might be because it's more popular. But yeah, that's also a big part of the discussion, right?
Yes, indeed. In fact, I think this applies to developing countries in particular, where there is a lot of momentum towards climate action than any other sustainable development goals for various reasons. And that's precisely what I'm going to ask Anna next. This is something related to cities in developing countries. And I was wondering that, since you have done research on this, you must have come across the difficulty, like you mentioned, in the implementation with regard to the pre-existing institutional frameworks, whether they are ready to cope with the kind of changes that are happening, both in terms of climate change, as well as the changes happening with governance in general, as we see more and more action at different levels of governance. So I was just wondering, as cities are growing, like Marielle mentioned, cities are growing, the populations in cities are growing. So in that sense, developing countries in particular are urbanizing even more. So what are the kind of changes that developing countries are looking at in terms of bringing these changes or bringing these kind of structural changes? Secondly, what can they do more than whatever they are doing already?
That's very interesting. I think Marielle points to very important subtopics there. like why cities are focusing so much on climate change, and from all the 17 SDGs possibles. And there is no doubt this is a very strategic agenda for cities and for cities in development countries, also because there is a lot of money there. So there's a lot of possibilities for financing local projects that were already planned but weren't implemented. So I think there is a very strategic point there. And also we have to remember this is a political agenda. So this is a very political topic, and many times it is used as a way to position local leaders in the international arena, but also to expose them more nationally. So this is something interesting as well. In terms of the SDGs and the cities I'm looking in Latin America, many of the things that I am seeing now is that governments like the city of Bogota is trying to bring the SDGs as the main drive of their city planning. So this has been a very interesting thing to see how United Nations agenda is able to help design an entire local planning strategy. So this is very interesting, and I really would like to call attention for that, because as well as in part, if we remember the 21st agenda, from back to Rio 1992, these international documents help planning public policies, and this is very important for Latin America. So even though many of the SDGs will not be achieved, unfortunately, they do change the local planning, public policy planning. And this is very important. This is especially for cities that don't have the human resources to make a very ambitious plan. Having this agenda guiding their decisions is really helpful. How they are managing the SDGs in terms of implementation is another thing. So I'm sure the SDG, on climate change, the 13 SDG is really vocal. We can say it's a very powerful narrative for cities in Latin America, but I am also concerned that other SDGs like gender equality are less explored as they should be. And just to come back a minute for the importance of focus on cities, and I think the United Nations have had this clear since 1996, after the UN Habitat Conference in Istanbul, that if you want a goal to be achieved, you have to localize it. So since then, and specifically with the SDG, the main discourse of United Nations has localized the SDG, involve city planning, involve civil society organizations, because then you have more chance of having successful implementation. And just to end this part of my argument, just to remember that Latin America is the most urbanized region in the world. So any solution to climate change and others challenges we face, our societies face, has to have an urban perspective. There is no way to have a solution for any of these major problems without looking to urban spaces. And I don't think this is very clear to most of the people. People tend to forget that, focusing on the national state and forgetting there is specific difficulties in urban spaces that needs to be tackled if we want a successful implementation of the SDGs and other development agendas.
Thank you, Anna. Marielle, my next question is to you. And a lot of your research, in fact, talks about specific transnational city networks, examples like C40, 100 resilient cities, and different kinds of city networks which have set agenda for how cities will be part of this global climate governance. And there are a lot of course, there are models which have been adopted by these. I was just wondering if you could also talk about how do they function, how do they ensure compliance, for instance, considering they include cities from all over the world, across geographies, across different development scales, for instance. So what are their achievements so far, and what do you think are the shortcomings of these city networks in the medium and long terms?
So it's interesting that you would mention C40 and 100 resilient cities, or 100 RC, because, well, first because I presented something yesterday about exactly this comparison between C40 and 100 RC, but also because they happen to be, in my understanding, they happen to be part of a same group of new generation city networks. And these city networks are rather recent, and they have some enforcement mechanisms, and they're also very much supported by private philanthropies. So this is a category of city networks that I focus on, but there are many other city networks with different types of functioning. I'll just mention ICLEI, which is very well-known city networks as well, and it relies on very different mechanisms, much more voluntary mechanisms. So, and hoping that cities will follow. In the case of C40 and 100 RC, there are specific ways in which the networks try to make cities follow their lead, try to comply with the mechanisms in place. So, for example, in the case of the C40, you'll have, as a city member, you'll have to follow some participation standards. And if you don't, at a certain point, you might get kicked out of the network. Of course, C40 won't say that publicly, but that's how it works. And that's what I got also from some interviews with C40 staff. And this kind of the same mechanism works inside 100 RC, which unfortunately ended its operations in 2019, but kind of regrouped into a less ambitious network, the Resilient Cities Network. But the same kind of obligation mechanism works. And it's very interesting because supposedly a network is voluntary, right? And that's definitely the case of ICLEI or other city networks. But it seems that in the last few years, networks have tried to have a different approach of creating more an incentive looking more like an obligation. So if you want to be part of our group, you're going to have to follow the rules. And if you do that, you're going to have a great reputation because you're going to be part of a group that's actually doing something, right? So there's an incentive for cities to do so, to kind of follow these rules, to kind of follow these obligations. They're never really legally bound, right, by the rules that the network set. But there is this, and whether it works, well, it probably does, at least to a certain degree, because being part of C40, being part of 100 RC means you're part of an exclusive club, an elite club, and it's a very good strategic, again, argument for cities to have to attract other actors and to attract other kinds of fundings. Now, regarding a few words regarding the shortcomings and the benefits of these networks. Well, I think these networks, they're very much criticized, or well, maybe not very much, but they have been criticized for not really achieving that much in terms of mitigation and in terms of quantifying results. But I do think that they enable more discussion among cities, and certainly among global cities, but also smaller cities and cities in the north, but also in the south. So that's very important because we need to talk about it more in order to act, right? So they kind of bring about a kind of normative change in the way that cities are crucial. As Anna mentioned, cities are crucial to climate issues. And at the international level of states around the table, cities are mentioned, but they're not yet quite seen as a crucial agent. But from these networks' perspective, they are. So this normative change is being made, and it's a very important one. It's the one that is likely to lead to more action. Regarding the shortcomings, well, of course, as I mentioned, there's this idea. It's not, their results are still not quantified or quantifiable. They're in the process of being so, but not quite yet. So there are still some questions about whether they really achieve something. I think they do, but it's maybe not something that's measured so far. And I was thinking of something else. Just yeah, I think that's an important point that I also want to make is that in these big networks are important global cities that are large emitters, yes, but also cities that are in many cases already taking action. It's actually not that hard to become part of a leaders group if you are already doing something, right? And if you're already doing a lot. And the problem in that sense of these, at least of these exclusive network, is that they're kind of preaching to the choir in some sense, getting the actors that are already doing something. But we also need a lot of action from cities that might be less important. That's obviously arguably less important, but that are very, very numerous. So we also need their action.
Yeah, okay. So my next question is to Anna, and this is about the concept of climate justice, because you did talk about a lot of issues regarding developing countries and cities in Latin America in particular. And climate justice is something that developing countries talk about a lot when it comes to the global agenda on climate change related issues. So in your experience, how have city governments or national level governments, how have they really integrated the issue of climate justice into climate governance in urban settings in particular? You also spoke about some of the sustainable development goals, which are closely sort of interrelated to the issue of climate justice as well. So can you maybe talk about a bit about your experience of looking at the issue of climate justice as well?
Sure. I think we have to divide the actors we are looking into. So I think cities specifically, but we can also say about states in Latin America, have incorporated very poorly until now the concept of climate justice into their actions and their policies. And much of that, specifically now looking into cities, is that most of the climate policies, climate discourses in those cities were fostered by these transnational networks. And these transnational networks, such as C40 or ICLEI, have only started talking about climate justice recently. And I don't think cities, specifically in Latin America, have incorporated, not at this point, this perspective. Although this is a very urgent topic for them, because we are talking about cities that are highly injustice in so many areas. And of course, climate change is only adding one more layer of injustice in those settings. So I think this will be a topic for the next few years that will grow, because the international debate is changing. So I do think it takes a little while for them to adapt their discourse and their policies. So I would say at this point, we don't have like a very active discourse and policies focusing on climate justice, unfortunately. But on the other hand, if we look to the civil society organizations in those cities, we have a lot of conversations about climate justice, environmental justice, because many of those organizations were already tackling injustice, social injustice, housing injustice, access to the city. So it was natural for them to start talking and start acting in terms of climate and environmental justice. But unfortunately for official governments, I think this is a very poor conversations. I think this is a very deficient conversation. And I really hope we could see this more active in the next years, because many of the plans that were designed to mitigation plans and also adaptation plans did not cover this perspective. And of course, there is a deficit, and we can say a democratic deficit on those plans. And I think this deficit really needs to be tackled. So this would be some agenda that would challenge the dynamic between these global cities and the international, but also these global cities and their civil society based on their communities, working directly with vulnerable populations.
Yeah, thank you for that response. And it's so important to discuss this issue as well. And so my next question is to Marielle. And this will go back to your research, in fact, on innovation. And it's a very interesting conversation as well to talk about how do cities contribute to social innovation in particular. And since you have also been a practitioner in that field, I'm sure you have a lot to discuss in that respect. So in one of your articles, in fact, you refer to the transnational municipal networks as harbingers of innovation for global adaptation governance. And then in that article, you speak about, of course, the city networks that you mentioned. But I was just wondering if you can also talk about what kind of innovation is really necessary for cities to come up with as the climate crisis is worsening. And secondly, what are the actors in that sense who can really play a huge role in shaping those innovations, whether they are public actors or private actors or public-private partnerships or civic groups? So in that sense, what kind of autonomy do these groups really have in terms of localizing responses and also implementing them in a way that really suits their interests?
Okay, so regarding your first question on the innovations, well, I think what's important more than having one innovation that you could use in many cities is having tons of innovations, tons of novel governance practices that you can use. So for me, the key, rather than one innovation, the key is to diversify the governance instruments that you're going to use in order to tackle climate change. There is no one-fits-all solution, is my message. Because there is a great variety of cities in terms of from the north, from the south, in terms of size, in terms of wealth, and of course, in terms of power, we need many diverse tools that we can apply, that city networks, for example, can apply in cities or can create for cities to use themselves. So that would be a first element. The importance of innovation lies in the fact that it enables to have multiple possible interventions. And that, for me, is key, because you're never, if you have one tool, for example, one great tool, like among states, a near universal treaty, legally binding, that will enable states to cut their emission from 20%. You might not be able to. You might not be able to apply it to very local contexts, right? So innovations are necessary for me in the sense that they create many tools that you might be able to actually use in specific contexts. So I understand that it's not maybe the concrete response answer that you were hoping for, but I think that's kind of how I would frame it in terms of why and how we need innovation. Now, regarding the second part of your question, well, these city networks actually they show that there is a constellation of factors around cities, working with cities towards climate governance, right? So urban climate governance, for me, in my perspective, is not just about cities. When you take a very local perspective, when you work in a city, you see that it's actually a bunch of actors, very different actors working together. So the reality in the city is not just governmental entities working together to achieve one specific public policy, right? So as a practitioner, actually, I saw that because I was coming from civil society, and we were kind of working with government, sometimes not, sometimes working with other non-governmental entities, and kind of trying to find our way in this constellation to achieve some sort of goal. And in the end, all these different actions would enable a public policy to pull through, for example. And it's the same at the level of global urban climate governance. And we have, for example, I guess the main two actors that are very visible are cities and city networks. But city networks are not just networks of cities and for cities, right? There's a bunch of actors, as I mentioned, for example, private philanthropies working behind or with these networks, and also corporations, and also international organizations, and research institutes, and all of these actors are working within their very specific perspective, with their own interests, working with cities at the local level. And it might work sometimes, it might not work also, because they have their very specific interests, which might not be those of cities at all. And also because in some city networks, at least, the perspective, I think, might not be localized enough. So, because they do want to apply some sort of global solution to very local problems, and that might not always work. So yeah, some city networks maybe, and it's not that it's not something that you might think at first, but some city networks actually might lack a little bit of a local perspective in that sense.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on to Anna now, and another very important and very interesting subject to study, which she is looking at, is para-diplomacy, in which cities engage in. And so I wanted to ask you more about the kind of para-diplomacy initiatives that you have seen and researched upon in the Latin American context. How do they really promote it, and how do they promote, say, climate action or SDGs? And how are they able to promote these kind of activities, say, across not just one region? In fact, looking at the whole global south, for instance, is there more scope for para-diplomacy between cities of the global south, for instance? So what has been your experience of researching on para-diplomacy? Where do you think are the golden spots, and where do you think is there more scope for cooperation between cities of the global south?
Okay. I think most of the studies on para-diplomacy were focused on, when they began in the 90s, how these international activities of cities and local governments and regions in general could foster development, especially for developing countries. So why the main question was why a city would engage in international relations. What gains can it get from the international arena? This was the main question, no? Because it is activity that needs human resources, that has the ability to be in international spaces and negotiate. So when I was working in Brazil, I also worked for a city organization in Brazil, nationalist cities organization in Brazil. And one of the main questions I would always ask for city leaders was, why are you engaged in the United Nations conference? Why are you engaged in international negotiations? Why this is important for your constituencies? And the response was always very diverse, but in the end of every response I got was, this was a political space that was interesting to be occupied. And so this is something we could not lose perspective, is that paradiplomacy and the international activities of local governments is also a new and another way to pursue politics goals. So with that in mind, many of the city networks that Latin American cities were part in the 90s were city networks that had cooperation as their main agenda, specifically technical cooperation. So Metropolis, UCLG, for the Mercosur region, we had a network of cities that were part of Mercosur, and Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, and how they could cooperate, for instance, in very specific issues like education, how they could manage to have a program that could connect their students, how they could improve security policies. So it was very specific topics, and all of them with the main goal of improving their development condition. This had a very north-south dynamic, a very dynamic that was based on the foreign aid, the traditional foreign aid assistance. So many of the cities received aid from international organizations, but also developed countries like Spain and Germany used to have, and also Canada had very powerful aiding agencies, sending money, sending technical assistance to those cities. In the 2000s, at least this dynamic to change, mostly because of the discourse has changed as well. So the discourse of these emerging economies, India, Brazil, Mexico, so they didn't need more money, so they could now help their fellows cities in Africa or in Asia or in other countries in Latin America that were not emerging economies. So there is a shift in this technical cooperation among cities in the dynamic of paradiplomacy, and I think that Marielle brings the debate very, very clear that C40 is, in 100 Resilient Cities, is a new dynamic in paradiplomacy. And this is in part in my articles, in my dissertation as well, this transitioning from this very in the 90s and in the 2000s, and how they change and how the discourse changed, the goals change, and how paradiplomacy now is much more, we also say, more professional design. And it has, I think, what is very powerful organizations, specifically C40, that has a very vocal space in the international arena, not only among cities, but with national states and United Nations, is that being part of these networks start to be the priority of cities in Latin America. So we see that more cities want to be part of this exclusive club. and less doing technical cooperation projects with their South correspondents. So but also, once again, this is more when we look to global cities, to this gigantic metropolis, and when we go to more medium-sized cities, we can see that technical cooperation is still a very important part of their diplomacy. So trying to respond in a more brief way is that under the concept of paradiplomacy, we can see many activities that foster international relations from local governments.
Okay. Yeah, so that's a good way to sum it up. And this is my last question for this episode, and it's directed towards Marielle. And since you mentioned technology as an important part of urban climate governance, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, as to how technology can really help transnational municipal networks to advance climate governance at the local level, or even at the global level for that matter.
Yeah, so that's a whole subject, but from my understanding at the moment, and it's some research that I'm only starting at the moment, technology is seen by many actors, and not just in urban climate governance, but in global climate governance, as a whole stream of solutions that that we need to use in order to achieve our climate targets. And climate city networks really focus, really look at technology as, well, maybe not all networks. Again, there's a whole diversity of networks out there, and they have different ways of functioning and different perspectives, right? But several city networks, at least, really see technology as a crucial part of a city's climate policy, in a way, which is probably probably necessary. I'm not saying it's not, certainly not. But I think we also need to interrogate the need for technology, right? And I do think that maybe city networks do not do that enough. They tend to tell cities to use technologies, and a variety of technologies, right? So of course there's technology for clean energy, for example, and for smart transportation, and all of this is probably very useful. There's also technologies such as distributed ledger technology, or blockchain related technologies that enable cities to be more transparent about their data. And once again, I'm not saying that it's not important. It surely is, but it's not the only solutions that we should take, or that cities should take. And so my research right now is about interrogating why transnational municipal networks tend to focus on these technology-related solutions against other solutions, such as nature-based solutions, for example, that also might be very good options. And I think behind it, once again, there are very different and very diverse interests at play. So all these actors playing with city networks and trying to work with cities are very much interested in promoting technology-based solutions in cities, maybe more than nature-based solutions, for example. And it's also a way, probably technology-based solutions are probably a way to keep working within the same model of production, of consumption, right? And not really try to diverge to a very different model that we know would be a very interesting solution, but that would completely change our way of producing, of consuming, etc. So I believe that this focus on technology is interesting in many different aspects, as I mentioned, transportation, in data transparency, which is a crucial issue, especially for cities. As I mentioned before, cities all have their own way of measuring their emissions, and that's a big issue for us researchers, but also for practitioners and for everybody working on city issues, right? But these technologies might not be the best solutions for cities, or some of these technologies at least. And they might not be the best solution for specific cities, smaller cities, or cities from the global south who do not have the funding to have this technology. We also need to think about who creates these technologies, right? So some of these technologies might have a very north-focused kind of functioning that might not be applicable to cities, to small cities from the global south, for example. So all of this we need to interrogate more. So that's what I want to do in my research project, and that's why I think, that's why I'm focusing on these and all of these huge amount of technology-based solutions that transnational city networks promote. I hope that kind of answers your question, Dhanasree.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I know it was difficult to sum up such a huge body of research, and also since you're going to research more on this, it would be interesting to know what are the outcomes of it. So this brings me to the end of this episode. So I would like to really thank from the bottom of my heart both Anna and Marielle for joining from the other side of the globe. It's early morning for them, but yet we made it possible, and we, as I mentioned in the beginning, very happy that 3 researchers from the Earth System Governance could join together to discuss a very important topic. And of course, Earth System Governance promotes this kind of research. There is a working group on urban governance as well, which is, of course, steering research on cities as part of global climate governance. So once again, thank you so much to both of you for joining us on this episode and for talking about such a great array of issues, in fact, starting from innovation and technology to climate justice to para-diplomacy. So whole gamut of issues we have managed to cover, but of course we need to keep the discussion on. And I would also like to thank Manipal University's Climate Center for making this possible, and the Bridge Project, of course, for curating this episode, and particularly to the students and the team which came up with the questions after going through some of your works. And thank you so much to each and everyone who managed to join this episode from various parts of the world, and hope to see you in the next episode that we are going to do next week, and hope to again join you, Anna and Marielle, in some other conference or something like that. Take care and see you again. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anna, Dr. Marielle, and Dr. Dhanasree, for participating in this discussion. To watch this session on YouTube and also to listen to our previous podcast, please do visit our website, www.thebridgeproject.in. Please like and share this video with your friends and colleagues. We'll be back soon with another interesting discussion. Till then, this is Mrinmoy from the Bridge Project signing off. Thanks for watching.